Hello everybody, Ben Rogers here, 3&D Basketball, back with another video, and today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at Playoff P, Paul George, and sort of map out the rise and fall of his playoff career, and get into the nitty-gritty as to why he struggled with the Oklahoma City Thunder in recent years, and more recently with the LA Clippers. Obviously, Paul George has been in the news recently with his struggles against Luka Doncic and the Dallas Mavericks, particularly shooting from the field. In games 2 and 3, he's only put up 14 and 11 points respectively, shooting 7 of 33 from the three-point line during that stretch, and shooting 18% and 23% in those two games. Obviously, for a guy that's a 6-time All-Star and a 5-time All-NBA guy, those are some poor numbers, especially when you're supposed to be the number 2 option on a team that a lot of people have expectations to sort of make the NBA Finals and potentially win an NBA championship. So this has led a lot to question, can Paul George really perform in the playoffs, and can he really be the second guy for Kawhi Leonard's LA Clippers to really lead that fan base, well, they don't have much of a fan base, but lead that franchise to an NBA championship? We're going to take a look into the past to see if Paul George's game can really translate to postseason success, and take a look at the past few years to see if those narratives that Paul George struggling in the playoffs are really true, and if so, what's the cause of that major drop-off in the postseason action? For people that don't know, Paul George had a really encouraging start to his playoff career, being on those Indiana Pacers teams that were arch rivals to the Miami Heat when LeBron James had his tenure down in South Beach. Obviously, not a lot of people expected the Indiana Pacers to win a lot of games versus the Big Three in Miami, but the emergence of Paul George really kind of set the tone and took a lot of people by surprise at that time. During his first couple playoff series, Paul George was sort of the understudy to high-volume scorer Danny Granger and acted as mostly a role player during his rookie and sophomore seasons. But after Danny Granger had some injuries, Paul George was really given the reins to that team and had some really interesting playoff battles with LeBron James' Miami Heat for the following years, taking them to 7 in a couple of series. But before his first big battle with LeBron, he sort of partook in a forgotten series, which was his first real test as the main guy on his team versus the New York Knicks in the 1 year in my lifetime that they really seemed relevant in the NBA. They were led by Carmelo Anthony, Amar'e Stoudemire, and Tyson Chandler, and had high expectations to be the team that would face LeBron in the Eastern Conference Finals. But Paul George, as the main guy, was able to lead them over the Knicks in 6, but did show some inklings of struggles in that series. He shot 27% from 3, below 40% from the field, averaging about 19 points per game, but those low percentages were definitely cause for concern for Pacers fans with Paul George really being their main guy, and he had some really off nights in that series, like we're currently seeing now in his tenure with the LA Clippers and obviously Oklahoma City Thunder, where, especially from 3, went 2 for 12 in one game, 1 for 9 from the three-point line, so definitely not the sort of numbers and the efficiency you want to see from your main player. But the following series, he seemed to put all of his doubters and haters in the quiet, besides obviously Skip Bayless, who named him George Paul, but we'll leave that aside. But Paul George, as a 22-year-old basketball player, came out and stood head-to-head with LeBron James, took him to 7 games, and put up similar scoring numbers, but on much more efficient shooting. He was shooting about 44% from the three-point line, which is really encouraging to see, and solid numbers from the field. Had a lot of people expecting him to really give the Miami Heat some tests, and LeBron James in the Eastern Conference, give them some tests for the years to come. And the following season, that wasn't really the case. Even though the Pacers had a hot start to that year with PG and Roy Hibbert making the All-Star team, they really struggled from that point after the All-Star break. They remained the first seed in the Eastern Conference due to the big lead they got in the first 4 months of the season, but struggled against the 8th seeded Atlanta Hawks, and then against the Washington Wizards. Paul George really dropped some duds in this series against John Wall and Bradley Beal, only scoring 11 points in Game 2 of that series in 41 minutes, shooting 5 of 13 from the field. And then in Games 5 and 6, which were closeout games for the Pacers, they could have really put them to bed. Paul George only had 15 points on 5 of 15 shooting, and 12 points in the closeout game on 4 of 11 shooting. So he had some big games also in that series too, 39, 23, and 18, I guess, but you want to see more from your superstar player if you're the Indiana Pacers. But they were pretty outmatched against the Miami Heat in the following series, losing that series in 6, sneaking a game 1, which I guess a lot of people do to LeBron James-led teams. But Paul George had an average performance in this series, having some lower scoring games, some higher scoring games, but still, at this point, Paul George's performances looked pretty promising, despite some inconsistencies as a young player. If people remember, following this series, Paul George had that devastating injury with USA Basketball, which put his career on pause until about 2016, where he had his next playoff matchup against the Toronto Raptors, who were heavy favorites in this one, being the 2 seed, and the Pacers were a one-man show with Paul George being the 7 seed, and I guess Solomon Hill stepped up in that playoff series, but it was an impressive showing for Paul George, to say the least. Obviously, I was a Raptors fan, so I watched this one really in depth, and Paul George dominated the series. There was no real answer the Raptors had for him, and he almost single-handedly won the Indiana this series, bringing it to 7, and the Pacers had no real business doing that. So at this point, Paul George's playoff career, despite some duds, specifically against the Knicks and some games against Miami, he's played well, especially as a young emerging star in the NBA. But then Paul George, as everyone knows, demanded a trade to Oklahoma City, and this is where Playoff P was sort of born.
Yeah, I'm used to it. I'm used to this. Y'all ain't met Playoff P yet, huh?
Oklahoma City had a lot of high expectations when Paul George went over there, as obviously 2 years prior they were right in the championship hunt with Kevin Durant, and obviously since he infamously left to the Golden State Warriors, Russell Westbrook came out with his MVP season and was just looking for that co-star to really take the Thunder to the place that KD never could. But unfortunately, Paul George went down there, giving himself the name of Playoff P to amp all the fans up, because I guess up until that point, he was a strong playoff performer. Really dropped a dud in that first round for the Oklahoma City Thunder. Their first round matchup was the Utah Jazz, and despite the fact Paul George did drop 25 points per game, which is what you'd expect from an all-NBA caliber of player, in the games where it really mattered, Paul George really showed up small. In Game 6, which was a closeout game for the Utah Jazz, Paul George had 5 points in that one, only shooting 2 of 16 from the field. 12% for an All-NBA guy in a closeout game. That was the first really discouraging game we've really seen that sort of shifted the narrative on Paul George. He shot 0% from the three-point line, 0 for 6 from 3, so that's the one that really changed the tone, because he did have some solid numbers in that series, but didn't really set the tone, which would have put OKC over the top, and they were favorited against the Utah Jazz. I guess looking at the numbers in the series, you do have to give some credit to Paul George, because he did have some big games, scoring 34 points in a win in Game 5, 32 in a loss in Game 4, but the games 2 and 3 where OKC eventually really lost control of this series. He only had 18 points on 6 of 21 shooting, and 23 points, I guess it's a solid game, on 7 of 16, but not the numbers you're looking for a guy that's supposed to take you over the top. Then that brings us to last season, where he really earned his title of being a playoff underperformer, where he didn't have the worst box score in a series against the Portland Trail Blazers, but a lot of people had them favorited to win that series against Portland, and they ended up losing that one in 5, and he had some pretty poor performances despite playing well in the closeout game in that series. In Game 1, he shot 8 of 24 from the field and 4 of 15 from the three-point line, 26%, which was tough for them to really pull out a W in that one, and ended up getting fouled out in that one, which obviously led to the Oklahoma City Thunder losing. And in Game 3, which was actually interesting enough their only win in that series, he shot 3 of 16 from the field, 18%, and despite scoring a high volume in terms of putting points on the board, and despite putting a high point total, 27 points per game, he just was underperforming from the eye test, from efficiency, and obviously it didn't help him that Dame Lillard hit that shot in the deep to ice the series right in his face, and then he had that unfortunate quote after saying that shot's a bad shot, despite the fact Damian Lillard is, along with Steph Curry, probably the 2 best people in history at shooting those long ball threes. So it was a tough situation for Paul George, which inevitably led him to now. with the LA Clippers, and he keeps hurting his own playoff narrative in these first 3 games of the NBA postseason. I brought it up in the start, despite having a decent game 1, he's really struggling games 2 and 3 against a Dallas defense that people don't really expect to be a clamped down, lockdown team, because they obviously have one of the best offense in NBA history according to the numbers, and you know, the defensive end is really where they give a lot up on that end of the floor. Now that we've sort of taken an in-depth look at Paul George's career and saw the highs and the lows, we have to sort of break down what is it that's made him sort of struggle in the postseason in recent years that firstly hasn't led his teams to translate to wins, despite the fact he has high scoring output, and you know, if his game can really translate in the future with this LA Clippers team. To answer that first question, I think the biggest issue with Paul George is despite the fact he has all of the intangibles to sort of create his own shot, to shoot that smooth stroke, and a decent dribble handle, you know, he really struggles in putting it all together to really take advantage of certain matchups and looks to other players to really get his game going. And that has really made him struggle as the alpha guy, particularly in series where people are loading up on him. I think the only real series he showed a capability to do that was against the Toronto Raptors in 2016, to do that at a really high level. So I think that inability really puts a ceiling as to where he can get with playoff performances. I think that inability to really create for his own leads to those inconsistent games we see throughout a lot of series, where he does have some high scoring outputs, but the next day he'll sort of get those same shots and just struggle vitally from the field, shooting really inefficiently. So I think that's the biggest issue with Paul George, and now seeing if that can translate for the LA Clippers, that's a tough question, because it depends on what you're asking from Paul George. Do I think he can be a guy that, if he doesn't seem to force his shots and looks to take those open threes, could he be a positive second guy playing off Kawhi Leonard? I think that can be the case, but if they're expecting him to really run the offense in some playoff settings and be a guy that you can rely upon night in, night out to really give Kawhi some breaks, I don't know if the history has shown that Paul George can really do that for a team. Now, maybe he'll prove me wrong, and you know, he'll sort of wipe across those past demons with the playoffs, particularly the inconsistencies, because we know his game can translate on any given night to do that, but to do it consistently, you have to be able to create your own shot on a consistent basis against tough defense, and I just haven't seen that before. But let me know what you guys think. Do you think Paul George can really amp up his game in the future and to flip a switch for this LA Clippers team and potentially win them a championship? Or do you think Kawhi Leonard made a poor decision choosing him to be the guy to team up with in LA? Let me know in the comment section below. You're the best to make it this far. Check out the Twitter, this channel's Instagram. We have a blog going now, so if you want to sort of read some of the articles I've made on past sort of topics, definitely check out all the videos here. We're really excited to get this channel going. So yeah, you guys are the best. Cheers.